The morning sun rose over the sprawling San Diego Naval Base, casting long golden streaks across the tarmac. A faint hum of helicopters echoed from the nearby airfield, blending with the sound of boots striking pavement. The smell of fuel, sea salt, and metal hung in the air, the familiar scent of discipline and duty. Amid the early buzz of activity, a black government SUV rolled past the security gate and came to a halt near the administrative building. From the passenger side, a woman stepped out. She was tall, lean, and carried herself with an ease that immediately drew attention. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, a transfer from an undisclosed unit, or so the papers said. To most, she looked like just another officer. But to those who really noticed, there was something about the way she moved. A quiet authority, a precision that didn't come from textbooks or training drills. She wore her uniform neatly pressed, her brown hair tied back into a tight bun. Her expression was calm, unreadable, the kind of face that never betrayed emotion. As she walked through the base, the young recruits and even some senior sailors couldn't help but glance twice. Some whispered, others laughed quietly, nudging one another. "Who's that?" one asked near the mess hall. "New officer, I think. Came from some special unit," another replied, shaking his head. "You know how it is. They move people around all the time." But gossip on a military base spreads faster than wildfire, and within hours, the entire compound was buzzing with curiosity. The mystery surrounding her transfer fueled speculation. Some said she'd been part of a failed mission overseas. Others claimed she was related to someone high up in command. Few believed the truth, that Sarah Hayes had once served in one of the Navy's most elite units, SEAL Team 7. She had survived the brutal Bud S training, a feat only the strongest men managed to accomplish. Her identity had been kept under wraps for security reasons. Only a handful of officers even knew who she truly was. Now she'd been reassigned to a new command, a quieter post, meant to give her a break after years of high-risk operations. But quiet was not something the military always guaranteed. That first morning, Sarah reported to Commander Briggs, a gruff, battle-worn man with 30 years of service behind him. His office walls were lined with medals, plaques, and faded photos from his deployments. When she entered, he glanced up from his paperwork, his expression sharp. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "I've read your file. Impressive service record." "Thank you, sir," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "You'll be assigned to logistics and operations review for now," Briggs continued, scanning her papers again. "Nothing too demanding. I know you've been in the field a long time. You'll find things are slower here." Sarah only nodded. Slower was fine. Or so she thought. When she left his office, the hallways buzzed with murmured voices that quieted as she passed. She caught snippets of sentences. Special assignment. Transfer. Probably can't handle the field anymore. She ignored them. Words didn't bother her. She'd been underestimated all her life. Later that day, she found herself in the base cafeteria during lunch hour. The room was loud, filled with laughter, metal trays clanking, and the constant hum of conversation. She carried her tray to an empty table, her back straight, eyes focused on her meal. Across the room, a group of young Marines sat together, exchanging smirks as they watched her. "She doesn't talk to anyone," one said under his breath. "Probably thinks she's better than us," another chuckled. "She's just another officer who never saw combat," the third added, his tone dripping with mockery. If only they knew. Sarah kept her focus steady, her face expressionless. But every movement, every sound around her was registered. Years of training had made her hyper-aware of her surroundings. She could feel their eyes on her, sense their judgment. But she didn't react. Later that evening, she went to the gym for her usual workout. The base gym was nearly empty, just the sound of weights clanging and the faint hum of a treadmill. She trained quietly, efficiently. No wasted motion, no showmanship. A few others noticed her form. Flawless technique, incredible endurance, but dismissed it as coincidence. When she finished, she grabbed her duffel bag and headed back to the barracks. The halls were dimly lit, most of the personnel either asleep or out on night watch. As she walked down the corridor toward her quarters, she heard low laughter echoing from the far end. 3 men leaned against the wall near the exit, the same Marines from the cafeteria. They straightened as she approached, exchanging amused glances. "Well, look who we've got here," one of them drawled. The officer too good to say hello. Sarah's steps didn't falter. "Excuse me," she said evenly, trying to move past them. But they didn't move. The tallest one, a broad-shouldered Marine named Mason, shifted slightly, blocking her path. "You know, it's rude not to greet your fellow soldiers," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his. Her voice remained calm. "Step aside, Sergeant." Mason's grin widened. "Relax, we're just trying to be friendly." Behind him, the other 2 chuckled. "Yeah, lighten up, Lieutenant." The air in the corridor thickened, not with fear, but with tension. Sarah had been in this kind of situation before, though never among her own. She could sense their bravado, the mix of boredom and insecurity that made men act foolishly. Still, she stayed composed. "I'll say it once more," she said softly. "Step aside." Her tone was quiet, too quiet, and that unsettled them. Mason tilted his head, mocking her calmness. "Or what?" he asked, smirking. Sarah's eyes flickered, not with anger, but calculation. Years of experience taught her to gauge distance, size, movement. 3 opponents, all overconfident, all untrained in hand-to-hand tactics compared to what she'd learned. Her instincts kicked in, silent and sharp. She gave no sign of fear, no hint of emotion. Instead, she adjusted her bag on her shoulder and waited. The moment stretched like a wire, pulled too tight. Then Mason laughed and reached forward, his hand brushing her arm. That was his mistake. In one fluid motion, Sarah twisted her wrist, pivoted, and used his momentum against him. He hit the wall before he realized what had happened. Air knocked from his lungs. The 2 others froze, eyes wide. Sarah stood still, voice low but steady. "Don't make me repeat myself." For a second, no one spoke. The silence in the corridor felt heavy, electric. Mason straightened slowly, face red with shock and anger. "You're gonna regret that," he hissed. Sarah's expression didn't change. "I already do." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing through the hallway, calm, measured, unfazed. The 3 Marines watched her go, their pride wounded more than their bodies. But as Mason rubbed his shoulder, something about her movements stuck with him. The speed, the control, the absolute precision. He'd seen that kind of skill once before, during a SEAL demonstration years ago. His smirk faded as realization slowly dawned. The next morning, the tension inside the barracks was almost palpable. Word had started to spread, not the full story, just fragments whispered in passing. Mason got thrown into a wall by the new officer. Someone muttered near the coffee station. "He's saying she caught him off guard." Others snickered. No one really knew what had happened, and Mason was determined to keep it that way. He sat at the corner table in the mess hall, a dark bruise forming on his shoulder. Across from him, his friends, Corporal Diaz and Lance Corporal Reeves, leaned in, whispering. "Man, what really happened last night?" Reeves asked, lowering his voice. Mason scowled, stabbing his fork into his eggs. "She got lucky, that's all. Caught me off balance." Diaz raised a skeptical eyebrow. Lucky? You're twice her size. Yeah, well, she won't be so lucky next time, Mason muttered. No one makes a fool out of me on my own base. Reeves smirked. So what's the plan? You gonna get even? Mason's jaw clenched. She thinks she's better than everyone, walking around here like she owns the place. I just want to remind her where she stands. The others chuckled uneasily. They didn't fully agree, but they weren't about to challenge him. Mason had a reputation, aggressive, unpredictable, and fiercely proud. And pride, in the military, could be just as dangerous as a loaded weapon. Across the room, Sarah Hayes sat alone at her table, her eyes scanning a mission briefing document on her tablet. She seemed completely unaware of the whispers, or perhaps simply indifferent to them. Years in the field had taught her that the best way to handle ignorance was silence. Still, she could feel the shift in the air, the sideways glances, the murmured laughter that ceased when she entered a room. It wasn't new. She'd experienced the same attitude years ago when she first joined training. Back then, the instructors had told her outright, "You won't make it. Not because you're weak, but because you're not one of them." And yet, she had made it. She'd outlasted men twice her size, survived the freezing surf torture of Bud S., completed Hell Week, and emerged not just standing, but excelling. But here, at this base, none of that mattered. Her records were sealed. To everyone here, she was just another transfer officer. Later that afternoon, as the base settled into routine drills, Mason saw his chance. Sarah was in the storage wing, overseeing inventory checks for the supply unit. The narrow corridor was lined with metal lockers and equipment crates, quiet, isolated, away from the usual flow of personnel. He motioned to Diaz and Reeves, smirking. "Let's go have a chat with the lieutenant." The three men made their way down the hall, their boots thudding against the concrete floor. Inside the storage room, Sarah was bent over a clipboard, her focus sharp. When she heard footsteps approaching, she straightened slowly. "Mason," she said evenly, not surprised. "Something I can help you with?" He leaned against the doorframe, his tone casual. "Yeah, about last night. Thought maybe we could clear the air." Her expression remained unreadable. "There's nothing to clear." "Oh, I think there is," he replied, stepping closer. "You embarrassed me in front of my guys. That's not something people forget around here." Sarah's eyes flicked briefly toward his two friends, who now stood between her and the exit. Her voice stayed calm, steady, but her stance shifted subtly, weight balanced, ready. "You should walk away now, Sergeant." Reeves laughed. "Hear that, Mason? She's giving orders again." "Yeah," Diaz added mockingly. "I think she likes playing tough." Sarah took a slow breath. Her tone was quiet, but edged with authority. "You're out of line. Step aside before this turns into something you'll regret." But the men didn't move. They exchanged glances, that silent look soldiers share when their pride outweighs their sense. Mason took another step closer, invading her space. "You think because you're an officer, you can push people around?" He sneered. "No," she said softly. "I think because I've been where you'll never go, I don't have to prove anything." That line hit harder than he expected. He frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Before she could answer, he reached out again, hand closing on her sleeve, and the world shifted in a blur. Sarah's reaction was instant. She stepped inside his reach, twisted his wrist, and used his momentum to flip him onto the floor. The crash echoed through the corridor. Reeves moved next, swinging a lazy punch, which she sidestepped easily before driving her elbow into his ribs. He fell backward, wheezing. Diaz froze, his confidence evaporating as he saw his friends drop in seconds. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked down at Mason, who was struggling to get up, pain etched across his face. "This is your last warning," she said firmly. "If you ever touch me or anyone under my command again, I will report you. And next time, I won't be gentle." For a long moment, no one moved. The air was heavy with disbelief. Mason glared up at her, face red with anger and embarrassment. "Who do you think you are?" He spat. Sarah met his gaze. "Someone who's done more for this country than you can imagine." She turned, picked up her clipboard, and walked past them, leaving silence in her wake. Her boots echoed down the hall, steady, composed, unfaltering. When she was gone, Diaz exhaled shakily. "Man, what was that?" Reeves groaned from the floor. "She's not normal, dude. Nobody moves like that." Mason stayed silent, staring at the door. His pride burned hotter than the pain in his shoulder. "Find out who she is," he said finally. "I want to know everything." That night, in the barracks, Mason sat hunched over his laptop, scrolling through restricted personnel lists. He didn't have clearance for most of the files, but with a few favors and a friend in admin, he managed to access partial records. He typed Hayes, Sarah L. into the database. The results loaded slowly. Minimal details. Lieutenant, U.S. Navy. Reassigned from Special Operations Command. Clearance, Level 7. Mason frowned. Special Operations Command? He clicked further, but the rest of the file was locked. Red text flashed on the screen. Access denied classified record. He leaned back, jaw tightening. That wasn't standard for an officer transfer. He'd never seen that kind of clearance on anyone below Major. "What the hell are you hiding, Lieutenant?" he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her small quarters, staring quietly at a framed photo on her desk. Her SEAL team from 5 years ago. 7 men and 1 woman, all smiling, dirt-covered, standing in front of a helicopter after a successful extraction mission. 4 of them were gone now. She traced a finger along the photo's edge, remembering the firefights, the nights spent under enemy fire, the friends she'd lost. Being reassigned to this base wasn't punishment. It was survival. Command had insisted she take time to adjust, but no one understood that she didn't need rest. She needed purpose. Sitting behind a desk while listening to untested soldiers gossip about her felt like torture. She sighed and closed the photo frame. Out in the hall, the sound of boots echoed again, Mason's heavy stride, angry and deliberate. She didn't need to look to know he wasn't finished. Pride had a way of making men reckless. As she leaned back in her chair, she whispered softly to herself, a habit from her SEAL days. Stay calm. Stay ready. The base outside had gone quiet, the distant hum of the ocean faint through the open window. She closed her eyes briefly, her instincts alive again. She had thought this new post would be peaceful, but she could feel it now, the calm before a storm. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the San Diego sky in streaks of amber and crimson. The naval base quieted into its evening rhythm, footsteps softening, engines silencing, the once bustling courtyards now half empty. Inside the barracks, lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the steel-gray hallways where discipline met monotony. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes sat at her desk, reviewing a supply chain report. But her eyes weren't truly on the words. Her instincts buzzed, the kind of silent alert that years in covert operations had carved into her bones. Something was off. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the one that came before trouble. She exhaled slowly, trying to shake the tension. You're not on deployment anymore, she reminded herself. This is home soil. Safe. But deep down, she knew safety was relative. At that same moment, on the far end of the base, Mason sat outside the mess hall, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. He stared at the glowing ember, his mind replaying the scene in the storage wing over and over again. Each time, he felt the same humiliation rise in his chest, the memory of her calm face as she'd thrown him like a rag doll. Diaz approached cautiously. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Mason's jaw tightened. "You ever been humiliated in front of your own men?" Diaz shrugged. "Yeah, but usually I deserve it." Mason glared. "You think this is funny? That woman made a fool out of me. You know what everyone's saying now? That I got taken down by some transfer officer who's probably never seen combat." Reeves joined them, tossing a folded paper onto the table. "You might want to stop calling her that," he muttered. Mason frowned, unfolding the document. It was a blurred printout of Sarah's partially redacted personnel file. "Where'd you get this?" Reeves smirked. "A friend in admin. Don't ask names." Mason's eyes scanned the lines until one caught his attention. "Assigned to Special Operations Command, clearance level 7. His heart skipped. "Special Operations?" he whispered. Diaz leaned closer. "You think she's—" "No," Mason interrupted quickly, shaking his head. "That's impossible. There's no way they'd let a—" He stopped himself. "A woman?" Diaz finished flatly. Mason looked away. "I just mean, Navy SEALs are elite. There's never been one," Reeves cut in. "Maybe that's what they want people to think." The three men fell silent, each turning the idea over in their heads. If it were true, if Sarah Hayes was really one of them, then last night hadn't been luck. It had been control, restraint, mercy. But Mason couldn't accept that. His pride wouldn't let him. "I don't buy it," he said finally, crushing the cigarette beneath his boot. "She probably worked some intel desk. Paperwork and reports. That's it. Nothing else." Diaz didn't answer. He'd seen the look in Sarah's eyes during that brief encounter. Calm, assessing, dangerous. That wasn't the look of a desk officer. It was something else entirely. Back in her quarters, Sarah stood by the window, the cold night air brushing her face. She'd learned long ago that silence could be as revealing as noise. Tonight, she could feel the watchful tension from the men on base. The unease wasn't paranoia. It was the atmosphere of challenge, like a predator circling, waiting for an opening. She turned away from the window and reached for her duffel bag under the bed. Inside, neatly folded, was her old SEAL combat uniform. She hadn't worn it in months. Alongside it was a small black box, her insignia, a trident gleaming faintly in the dim light. Her fingers brushed the cool metal. "They don't know who you are," she thought. "And they don't need to. But if they push, they'll find out." Just then, a knock sounded at her door. 3 short raps, firm, purposeful. She straightened. "Who is it?" "Sergeant Mason," came the voice. Her stomach tightened, but her expression stayed neutral. "It's late, Sergeant." "What do you need?" "Just a word," he said. 5 minutes. Sarah hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it halfway. Mason stood there, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, her tone clipped. He held up his hands slightly. "Relax, Lieutenant. I'm not here to fight, just talk." Sarah studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. 2 minutes. He stepped in, glancing around her small quarters, the neatly made bed, the clean desk, the bare walls. "You travel light," he remarked. "Old habit," she replied. "Say what you came to say." Mason met her gaze. "I don't like being made a fool of." "You did that yourself," she said calmly. His jaw clenched, but he continued. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but people around here don't take kindly to outsiders acting like they run the place. I'm not here to run anything, she said. I'm here to do my job. That's it. Yeah, but that's the thing, he said, stepping closer. Your file's sealed. You're not just some logistics officer. Who are you, really? Sarah's eyes hardened. That information is classified. Classified? Mason repeated with a mocking laugh. What are you, CIA? Some kind of spy? She didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Mason smirked. I knew it. You're hiding something. Sarah's tone dropped, low and sharp. You're out of line again, Sergeant. I won't tell you a third time. Back off. He tilted his head, feigning innocence. Or what? Her eyes didn't flinch. Or you'll find out why my file's sealed. For the first time, Mason felt something, not fear, but uncertainty. There was something in her voice, something in the way she held herself. It wasn't bravado. It was quiet, absolute confidence, the kind you only get after surviving things most people couldn't imagine. He looked away, suddenly aware of how small the room felt. You think you scare me? He muttered. Sarah didn't move. No, I think you don't know what fear is yet. The words landed like a strike. Mason's pride flared again. You're lucky you outranked me, he snapped. No, she said quietly. You're lucky. I don't care about rank. Mason froze, unsure whether she meant it as a threat or a warning. He started to speak, but she'd already turned away, her back to him as she calmly picked up the report from her desk. Good night, Sergeant, she said, dismissing him without another glance. He hesitated, jaw tight, then turned on his heel and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Sarah stood still for a long time after he left, staring at the closed door. Her pulse was steady, but her thoughts were racing. She'd given him his warning, the last one. She didn't want another confrontation. But experience told her this wasn't over. The next day, Mason's frustration boiled over. In the mess hall, surrounded by a handful of off-duty soldiers, he ranted. She thinks she's untouchable, he said. You should have seen the way she looked at me last night, like I was nothing. I say we remind her that she's not as tough as she thinks. Diaz frowned. Mason, don't. You're digging a hole you can't climb out of. But Mason wasn't listening. Pride had blinded him to reason. She doesn't belong here. She needs to learn that. Reeves hesitated. You're seriously going to go after her again? After what happened? Mason's grin returned, cold and deliberate. We'll pay her a little visit tonight. Just a chat. Nothing serious. Diaz looked at him, concern flickering in his eyes. You're gonna regret this. Mason's grin didn't fade. Not this time. That evening, the barracks were quiet. The halls were dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. Sarah sat at her desk again, reading the day's report, when she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside her door, more than one pair. Her muscles tensed instantly. They stopped right outside. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder. Sarah closed her laptop, rose to her feet, and took a slow breath. Lieutenant Hayes, Mason's voice called. We need to talk. She didn't move. Didn't answer. Come on, he said, his tone low, coaxing. Don't make this difficult. She could hear Diaz whispering behind him. Mason, stop. This is stupid. Sarah's voice finally broke the silence. Calm, controlled, and ice-cold. You've had your warning, Sergeant. Walk away. There was a pause. Then Mason chuckled. Or what? Sarah's eyes narrowed. Her heart rate didn't rise. Her breathing didn't quicken. Instead, she reached for the duffel bag beneath her bed and unzipped it halfway, just enough for the faint glint of the seal trident to catch the light. Her voice came again, quiet but unmistakable. Or this won't end the way you think. The hallway outside Lieutenant Sarah Hayes's quarters was dim, the only light coming from a flickering overhead bulb. Shadows swayed against the walls as three figures stood just outside her door. The muffled hum of night generators filled the air, but inside the barracks, everything was still, too still. Sergeant Mason's knuckles hovered over the door for a moment before he finally knocked again, harder this time. Thud, thud. Inside, Sarah straightened. She could tell by the weight of the footsteps that there were three of them: Mason, Diaz, and Reeves. She'd known this would happen. Pride was predictable. Men like Mason couldn't stand being challenged, especially not by a woman. Especially not by one who had bested him. Her voice came calm and sharp through the door. "Sergeant Mason, I'll give you one last chance to leave." From the other side came laughter, nervous from Diaz, mocking from Reeves, and confident from Mason. "Come on, Lieutenant," Mason called. "You can't hide in there forever." Sarah exhaled softly. Then, with a motion as fluid as breath, she turned the lock, opened the door, and stepped into the corridor. The three Marines straightened in surprise. She stood in the doorway, wearing her undershirt and fatigued pants, no weapon in sight, her expression unreadable. The overhead light cast a soft halo on her face, but her eyes, cold, focused, told another story. "Mason," she said quietly, "go back to your room." He smirked. "You really think I came here to chat?" He took a slow step forward, his tone dripping with false charm. "You embarrassed me, Lieutenant. I just want to." His sentence never finished. In a flash, Sarah moved. Her right hand grabbed his wrist mid-gesture, twisting it with surgical precision. He let out a sharp grunt of pain as she pivoted, sending him crashing into the metal wall. Diaz and Reeves reacted instantly, but too slowly. Before Diaz could grab her, Sarah swept his legs out from under him and spun around, blocking Reeves's swing with her forearm. A heartbeat later, she drove her elbow into Reeves's midsection, knocking the air from his lungs. The sound echoed. Down the corridor, the dull thud of bodies hitting steel, the sharp intake of breath, the clatter of a dropped flashlight. Then, silence. Sarah stepped back, her chest rising and falling evenly. The three Marines groaned on the floor, disoriented, shocked by the speed and precision of what had just happened. Mason, red-faced and furious, scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm. "What the hell?" he gasped. "How did you?" Sarah didn't answer. She simply said, "Don't make this worse." But Mason's pride burned hotter than his pain. "You think you can humiliate me again?" He spat. "You're done, Hayes." "You hear me?" He charged. Sarah sidestepped effortlessly. His momentum carried him forward, and she caught him by the collar, using his own force to flip him over her shoulder. He hit the ground hard, the impact shaking the lockers beside them. Diaz, still groggy, tried to stand. "Mason, stop. She's not normal," he stammered, eyes wide. Reeves backed up, watching Sarah with growing dread. "She's trained," he muttered under his breath. "No one moves like that." Mason groaned, pushing himself up again. He swung wildly, a clumsy, rage-fueled punch. Sarah ducked and stepped inside his guard, landing two quick strikes, one to his solar plexus, another to his chest. The air rushed out of him as he fell to his knees, wheezing. She leaned down slightly, her voice steady and quiet. "I told you to walk away." Her words weren't loud, but the authority in them silenced everything. Even Diaz and Reeves froze, neither daring to move. For a moment, all anyone could hear was Mason's ragged breathing and the distant hum of a generator outside. Sarah straightened, her stance relaxed but ready. Every instinct told her the fight was over. But Mason's ego wasn't finished. He lunged again, grabbing at her arm, and that was when she moved like lightning. A twist, a shift in weight. A blur of movement. In seconds, Mason was on the ground once more. Face down, his arm locked behind his back in a hold that could easily dislocate his shoulder. Sarah's knee pinned him in place. She leaned close enough that he could feel the calm in her breath when she spoke. "You're going to listen to me carefully," she said quietly. "I don't care about your pride or your rumors. But if you ever threaten me again, I will end your career before you can stand back up. Understood?" Mason struggled, but couldn't move. You're insane." "No," she replied, tightening the hold just enough to make him wince. "I'm trained." There's a difference. The fear in his eyes was real now. He'd seen fighters before, but nothing like this. There was no hesitation in her. No anger. Just cold, perfect control. The kind that comes from hundreds of hours of combat and a lifetime of discipline. Diaz finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Lieutenant, what are you?" Sarah released Mason and stood, her expression unreadable. "Go back to your quarters," she said. But Diaz didn't move. He looked up at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. "You're not just an officer, are you?" Sarah didn't answer. She turned away, heading for her room. Reeves helped Mason up. His voice shook. She's something else, man. No one fights like that." Mason wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, his mind spinning. "No one's supposed to fight like that," he muttered. Then, as if confirming something to himself, he whispered, "Special operations." "It has to be." The three men limped away down the corridor, too shaken to speak further. When Sarah closed her door behind her, the silence inside was deafening. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Combat, even controlled, always carried an aftershock. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. She didn't want to report them. She didn't want attention. But this couldn't go unaddressed. Mason wouldn't stop, not unless someone higher up made him. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing a report, factual, concise, detached. She described the altercation without embellishment. As she typed the last line, there was another knock at the door. This one was different. Firm, authoritative. "Lieutenant Hayes?" She opened the door to find Commander Briggs standing there. His eyes flicked to the bruise on her forearm, and then down the hallway, where two medics were now helping Mason and his friends toward the infirmary. "I assume you'll explain this," he said. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied evenly, handing him the report. "They initiated an altercation. I acted in self-defense." Briggs scanned the first few lines, his jaw tightening. He looked up, studying her face for a long moment. "Self-defense, huh?" "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "You handled yourself." "Efficiently." Sarah didn't answer. Briggs folded the report and slipped it under his arm. "Lieutenant Hayes, I've been in the Navy long enough to recognize real combat reflexes when I see them. You weren't trained for desk work, were you?" Silence. "I'm guessing this transfer was less about logistics and more about discretion," he continued. "I've seen your file, the redacted one." Her eyes flickered, but her voice stayed calm. "Then you know why it's classified, sir?" "I do," he said. "And I also know that if word gets out, this base will never see peace again." He took a breath, lowering his tone. "You did the right thing tonight, Lieutenant. But next time, don't handle it alone. You're not in the field anymore. You're among your own." Sarah gave a faint, tired nod. "Yes, sir." Briggs turned to leave but paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he added, "I'm glad someone finally taught Mason a lesson." A ghost of a smile tugged at Sarah's lips. "Permission to consider that classified, sir?" Briggs smirked. "Granted." That night, word spread across the base like wildfire. No one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone knew who was involved and how it ended. By morning, every corridor hummed with a single question. Who exactly was Lieutenant Sarah Hayes? Those who had seen her train, those who had seen her fight, those who had seen her calm under pressure, they all started to whisper the same rumor. She's one of them, a SEAL. And for the first time in a long while, silence followed her wherever she walked, not out of disrespect, but out of awe. Morning came heavy with whispers. By the time reveille echoed through the barracks, everyone on base had heard some version of the previous night's encounter. Some said Lieutenant Hayes had fought off 3 Marines with nothing but a broom handle. Others swore she'd disarmed a knife-wielding assailant blindfolded. A few even joked she must have been an undercover agent. But those who'd actually seen the aftermath, Mason limping toward the infirmary, Diaz holding his ribs, Reeves avoiding everyone's eyes, knew it wasn't a rumor. It was real. And the quiet woman at the center of it all? She was still as composed as ever. Sarah walked toward the mess hall, her steps measured, posture unshaken. Every table fell silent as she passed. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations froze. Eyes followed her with a mixture of fear, respect, and curiosity. She didn't glance at anyone. She simply filled her tray, poured her coffee, and found a seat in the far corner, the same spot she'd sat in every morning since her arrival. Across the room, Sergeant Mason sat with his arm in a sling, glaring. His pride had taken a worse beating than his body. His friends muttered quietly around him, but none dared approach her. "Man, that's her?" One whispered. "She took all 3 of you out?" Mason's jaw clenched. Drop it. But dropping it was impossible. The entire base was alive with speculation. By mid-morning, Commander Briggs had already called a closed meeting. Inside the small office, the air was thick with tension. Mason, Diaz, and Reeves stood at attention, each looking uneasy under the commander's hard stare. Sarah stood opposite them, hands clasped behind her back, expression unreadable. Briggs placed a folder on the desk and opened it slowly. "Last night," he began, "there was an altercation in the officers' barracks. 3 Marines approached Lieutenant Hayes in what appears to be a confrontation that escalated into a physical encounter." He looked up, his eyes sharp. "Now, before I continue, I'd like to make one thing very clear. Lying to me is career suicide." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," the Marines muttered. "Good." He turned his gaze to Mason. "Sergeant, your report claims this was a misunderstanding. Yet the security feed shows something different." Mason swallowed hard. "Sir, I admit we went too far. But I didn't know she'd—" Briggs cut him off. "Didn't know she'd what, Sergeant?" "Defend herself?" Mason looked down, saying nothing. Briggs closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "You're lucky, all of you. If Lieutenant Hayes hadn't exercised restraint, I'd be reading your eulogies instead of disciplinary reports." Diaz looked up, confused. "Sir, with all due respect, how is that even possible?" She moved like someone trained for Black Ops. "Nobody fights like that." Briggs's jaw tightened slightly. He shot a glance at Sarah, who remained still. "That's classified." Reeves frowned. "Classified, sir?" "Very classified." Briggs stood, stepping around his desk. "Gentlemen, what you encountered last night wasn't luck or coincidence. Lieutenant Hayes isn't an ordinary officer. You crossed a line with one of the most highly trained individuals in the United States Navy. That should scare you." The Marines exchanged uneasy looks. Mason's face paled. "Sir, who is she?" Briggs paused. Then, after a long silence, he said, "She's a member of SEAL Team 7. The words hung heavy in the air. Reeves blinked. "A Navy SEAL?" "Correct." Diaz shook his head slowly, disbelief painting his face. "Sir, there's no female SEALs." There are exceptions," Briggs interrupted firmly. And she's one of them. The room went silent. Even Mason stopped breathing for a moment. Briggs turned to Sarah. "Permission to disclose your record, Lieutenant?" Sarah's eyes flicked toward the Marines, then back to him. "Granted, sir. To the extent necessary." Briggs nodded and opened a separate, black-labeled folder. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, formerly Petty Officer First Class, deployed 6 times overseas. Participated in joint operations across Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia. Silver Star recipient. Operative under Task Force Trident. Graduated top of her class from Bud S training, one of only 2 women to complete the program. Mason's mouth fell open. "She's not just a SEAL," Briggs continued. "She's one of the few who's seen more combat in 10 years than most of us see in a lifetime." Sarah stood motionless, her eyes fixed forward, as if none of this surprised her. Briggs turned back to the 3 men. "Now that you know who you are dealing with, I suggest you remember your place." Mason lowered his head. "Sir, I didn't mean, intent doesn't matter," Briggs snapped. "Disrespect does." There was a long silence before Briggs finally exhaled. "Consider this your wake-up call, gentlemen. You owe Lieutenant Hayes an apology and your careers." Diaz and Reeves saluted immediately. Mason hesitated, jaw tight, pride warring with shame. Then finally he saluted too. "Lieutenant," Briggs said, turning to Sarah, "you're dismissed." She nodded and left without another word. Outside the office, the sun beat down on the base, reflecting off the asphalt. Sarah walked toward the training yard, away from the stairs that seemed to follow her now more than ever. Being revealed wasn't part of the plan. She'd requested this transfer for anonymity, a chance to breathe after years of operations no one could ever speak of. But anonymity rarely lasted long in her world. At the pull-up bars, a few younger recruits were watching her carefully. One whispered something, and another nudged him, shaking his head. Sarah ignored them. She grabbed the bar and began her reps, slow, perfect, disciplined. The murmur of conversation grew as more Marines stopped to watch. To them, she wasn't just another officer now. She was something different, something legendary. That afternoon, Briggs called her into his office again. This time, he wasn't stern. He was thoughtful. "Lieutenant," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "you didn't deserve what happened. But I also know you didn't want this kind of attention." "No, sir," she replied simply. He nodded. "I'm guessing anonymity was part of the deal that brought you here." "It was," she confirmed. "Well, consider that deal broken. Everyone knows now. You can't hide from it anymore." Sarah looked down briefly, then back at him. "Understood, sir." Briggs leaned forward. "You're a reminder, Lieutenant. Not just of what's possible, but of what discipline looks like. That base needed to see that." "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "But you did anyway." He stood and handed her a sealed envelope. "Orders from higher up. Classified operation. You're being reassigned, temporarily. SEAL Team 7 needs you for a mission in Yemen. You deploy in 72 hours. Sarah took the envelope, her pulse steady. "Understood, sir." Briggs studied her for a long moment. "Hayes," he said finally, "what you did last night, that restraint, that control, that's what separates a warrior from a brawler. Don't lose that. Not everyone can do what you do and still sleep at night." Sarah gave a faint, respectful nod. "I'll try, sir." He smiled slightly. "Something tells me you already do." When she left the office, the sun was setting over the base. The sky glowed orange and gold, reflecting off the distant ocean. The air smelled faintly of salt and jet fuel. As she walked past the barracks, several Marines stepped aside instinctively, offering small nods of respect. Even Mason, who stood by the railing, hesitated before quietly saying, "Lieutenant Hayes." She stopped. "Sergeant Mason." He swallowed, his voice low. "I owe you an apology. What I said, what I did, it was out of line. I didn't know who you were." She looked him straight in the eyes. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect, Sergeant." He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze a moment longer, then said softly, "Just learn from it." "I will," he promised. As she turned to leave, Mason called after her, "Lieutenant, for what it's worth, you earned my respect." Sarah didn't look back. "I didn't come here to earn it," she said over her shoulder. "I came here to serve." That night, the base lights shimmered under a sky full of stars. In her quarters, Sarah sat by the window, looking out at the ocean. The waves rolled softly against the shore, steady and endless, like the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her past was no longer hidden. The truth was out. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't bother her. Because now, they didn't just see a woman in uniform. They saw SEAL1 who had survived the impossible, one who had stood her ground, and one who had done it without losing herself. And somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. 3 days after the confrontation, the U.S. naval base at Coronado had changed. The shift wasn't loud or official. It was subtle, carried in glances and whispers. People who once saw Lieutenant Sarah Hayes as an outsider now stepped aside respectfully when she walked past. Conversations lowered to murmurs when she entered a room. Even the usual jokes and banter among soldiers had quieted. Sarah hadn't asked for the recognition. In fact, she despised it. She'd joined the Navy to serve, not to be the center of anyone's attention. But she knew enough about pride and ego to recognize what was happening. The men weren't just intimidated, they were humbled. The story had spread far beyond the barracks. Across the base, in the hangars and training yards, new recruits repeated it like folklore. 3 guys tried to corner her, one said, and she took them all down without breaking a sweat. "She's a SEAL," another whispered. "SEAL Team 7. Heard she's done covert ops in Syria." Most stories were exaggerated, but the truth, that she had single-handedly neutralized 3 aggressors, was impressive enough. On the 4th morning, Sarah was up before dawn as usual. The air was cool, carrying the salt of the nearby Pacific. She laced her running shoes, tied her hair back, and stepped outside. The track was nearly empty, except for one figure already running laps, Sergeant Mason. He noticed her immediately, but didn't stop. Instead, he nodded once in acknowledgement, a silent truce. Sarah returned the nod and started jogging in the opposite direction. They met halfway around the track. This time, Mason slowed to match her pace. "Didn't expect to see you out this early," she said without looking at him. "I could say the same," Mason replied, breathing steadily. "Figured I owed myself some humility laps." Sarah allowed herself a faint smile. "Better than paperwork." He chuckled. "I think Briggs wanted to assign me to toilet cleaning duty for a month. Got lucky." They ran in silence for a few moments before Mason spoke again, quieter now. "You know, I still can't wrap my head around it. A Navy SEAL." She didn't respond right away. "Does it matter?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you shouldn't respect me because of the title. You should respect everyone as if they might be capable of the same thing. That's the only way discipline holds up in uniform." Mason nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "You're right," he admitted. "Guess I forgot that." "Most people do," she said simply. They finished their laps in silence. 2 soldiers running not as adversaries anymore, but equals. Later that morning, the base commander gathered the entire training unit for drills. Sarah stood at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand, observing. Briggs had quietly assigned her a new responsibility, assisting in tactical instruction for small unit combat training. When the first group of Marines lined up, they were visibly nervous. One whispered, "That's her," while another muttered, "I heard she broke a guy's arm just by looking at him." Sarah ignored the chatter. "Pair up," she ordered. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried authority that commanded instant obedience. She demonstrated the first maneuver, a disarming technique with controlled grace. The precision in her movements drew silence from the group. When one Marine hesitated, she stepped closer and corrected his stance, guiding his wrist gently but firmly. "Don't think about brute strength," she instructed. "Think about control. Every movement has a counter. Find the line of balance and take it from them." By the end of the session, even the most skeptical Marines looked at her with quiet admiration. For the first time, Sarah saw something shift, respect replacing ego. That evening, Briggs called her into his office again. The man had a cup of coffee in his hand and an expression that was equal parts amusement and approval. "Word travels fast," he said. "You've become something of a legend around here." Sarah sighed softly. "That was never my goal." "I know," he said. "But legends don't ask to be made. They just happen." She didn't answer. Briggs leaned back. "You've done good work this week. You've turned a humiliation into a lesson. I've seen Mason training harder than ever. And those recruits, they're sharper now. You've set a new bar." Sarah shook her head. "I just did what anyone would do." He smiled faintly. "No, Lieutenant. Most people would have reported those men and demanded punishment. You handled it with discipline and control, and you've earned their respect because of it." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. Then quietly, she asked, "Do you think it'll last?" Briggs sipped his coffee. "Respect earned through fear fades. Respect earned through example doesn't. And from where I'm sitting, they're learning from you, whether you like it or not." She gave a small nod. "Then I'll make sure they learn the right things." "That's all I ask," he said. Over the next several days, Sarah's role at the base evolved naturally. She began running early morning endurance drills, volunteering for night watch rotations, and even leading small group exercises in unarmed defense. Her methods were simple, her tone calm, but her presence carried weight. Recruits began showing up early for her sessions, hoping to catch a glimpse of her technique. When she corrected them, they listened. When she offered feedback, they applied it immediately. And slowly, without intending to, Sarah became a mentor. One afternoon, during a close-quarters combat exercise, a young Marine named Alvarez approached her nervously. "Ma'am," he said, hesitating, "is it true you are the only woman in your SEAL training group?" Sarah glanced at him. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," he admitted sheepishly. "They say you broke records." She smiled faintly. "I broke a lot of bones, too. Mostly my own." The recruits laughed, easing the tension. "But yes," she continued, "I was the only woman in my class. The hardest part wasn't the physical training. It was convincing people I deserved to be there." Alvarez frowned. "And how'd you do that?" She looked him straight in the eye. "I stopped convincing them. I just did the work." The answer struck them more deeply than she intended. In that moment, something shifted again, admiration mixed with understanding. By the end of the week, Sarah had become the quiet heartbeat of the base. Her presence commanded both calm and motivation. The same men who once doubted her now pushed themselves harder, running longer laps, staying late after drills. Even Mason, who had once mocked her, now led his team with newfound discipline. When recruits grumbled, he'd simply say, "If Hayes can do it, so can you." And in that, Sarah saw something powerful, change born from humility. One evening, after a long day of training, she sat by the pier, the sound of waves breaking against the dock. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in deep orange hues. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her face. Footsteps approached behind her. Mason again. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She gestured for him to. They sat in silence for a long while before he spoke. "You changed the way people look at this place, you know." Sarah opened her eyes. "Maybe, but they'll forget eventually. People always do." "Maybe," Mason said. "But I won't. None of us will. You showed us what it means to wear this uniform, what it actually stands for." She looked out toward the horizon, where the sea met the last sliver of sunlight. "It's not about medals," she said softly. "It's about character when no one's watching. The real battles are fought in silence." Mason nodded slowly. "You really are different." "No," she replied. "I just stopped pretending I wasn't." That night, Sarah's phone buzzed on her desk. A secure message marked Priority 1. She opened it quietly, eyes scanning the encrypted text. "Orders confirmed. SEAL Team 7 mobilization scheduled. Operation Phoenix begins in 48 hours. She took a deep breath, staring at the words. The peace she'd found here was about to end. The real world, the one she had tried to leave behind, was calling her back. She folded the phone closed and looked at her reflection in the dark window. For a brief moment, she saw both versions of herself, the quiet lieutenant who had earned a base's respect, and the covert operative who had survived countless missions. Neither felt separate anymore. The base would remember her as the woman who changed everything, who stood her ground, who fought without hate, and who inspired an entire generation of Marines to be better. But for Sarah Hayes, it wasn't about legacy. It never had been. It was about doing what needed to be done, and doing it right, even if no one ever knew the whole story. The ocean was calm that morning, too calm for Sarah's liking. A glassy stillness hung over the base, the kind of silence that always came before chaos. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel as the team gathered near the hangar, loading gear into the waiting helicopter. The rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed in the distance, and for a moment, Sarah Hayes stood alone, watching the horizon burn with the first light of dawn. She had faced countless missions before, but this one felt different. This time, the mission wasn't just about rescuing hostages. It was about redemption for her, and for the men who once underestimated her. Commander Briggs had briefed them at 0400 hours. A U.S. intelligence operative was being held in a remote compound deep within the coastal mountains of Yemen. The insurgent group responsible was heavily armed, trained, and desperate. The operation required stealth, precision, and absolute trust between teammates, the very thing Sarah had spent months rebuilding. As she walked toward the helicopter, her boots striking against the tarmac, she caught sight of three familiar faces. The same Marines who had once cornered her in the barracks now stood at her side, helmets under their arms, rifles slung across their chests, waiting for her orders. Sergeant Kane, the tallest of the trio, met her gaze first. His expression carried something that hadn't been there before, respect. "Ma'am," he said simply, nodding. Sarah returned the nod. "We leave in 10. There was no bitterness left between them, only the silent understanding forged by time and humility. They had all learned their lessons, painfully, publicly, and now they were united by something greater than ego, survival. Inside the helicopter, the sound was deafening. Sarah strapped in, checking her weapon, her headset crackling to life. The pilot's voice came through, steady but tense. "We'll hit the drop zone in 20. Winds are good. Intel says hostiles are on high alert." "Copy that?" Sarah replied, her tone even. She glanced at her team, 6 operators in total. Every one of them trained, focused, ready. She saw in their eyes what she'd seen in her reflection countless times, a mix of fear and determination. The flight was long enough for her mind to wander. She thought of the years it had taken to get here, the grueling SEAL training, the doubt, the constant battle to prove she belonged. Every scar, every sleepless night, every failure had led to this moment. The same men who once sneered now trusted her with their lives. The helicopter banked hard to the left, the signal to prepare for descent. Sarah's heartbeat slowed. Years of conditioning had taught her to control it, to breathe, to focus, to narrow her world into a single, clear objective. The ramp lowered, flooding the cabin with humid air and the smell of earth. Night vision goggles flipped down, rifles raised. Go, go, go. They hit the ground running, boots sinking into soft sand, forming a silent line as they advanced toward the compound. Distant lights flickered on the hillside, sentries patrolling. Sarah raised a hand, signaling the team to halt. She studied the terrain. Rocky outcrops, sparse vegetation, a narrow ridge leading to the target structure. Every instinct screamed danger. 2 guards at the south wall, whispered Kane over comms. Sarah's voice was low but firm. Take the left flank. I'll cover. They moved like ghosts. The first sentry dropped before he even saw them, a silenced round finding its mark. The second turned just in time to glimpse a shadow before Sarah's gloved hand wrapped around his throat, pulling him silently to the ground. The team regrouped at the compound gate. Beyond it, they could hear muffled voices and crying. Hostages. Sarah signaled to breach. The explosion was quiet, contained, a flash of light and smoke. They swept inside, weapons up, clearing room after room with textbook precision. Then, gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the dark corridor, slamming into the concrete walls. Contact left, yelled one of the Marines. Sarah dove behind cover, firing controlled bursts. The exchange was brutal, close quarters, chaotic. She could hear her men shouting commands, the crack of rounds ricocheting. She leaned out, sighted, and dropped the shooter, pinning them down. Push forward, she ordered. They advanced, clearing the compound room by room. In the corner of a dimly lit cell, they found them. 3 hostages, weak but alive. One was the intelligence operative they'd come for. Sarah knelt, cutting their restraints. We're getting you out, she said softly. But just as she stood, a sudden explosion rocked the building. Dust filled the air. The walls shook violently. Ambush! RPG from the ridge. They were outnumbered now, enemy reinforcements pouring in from the hills. Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't hold the compound, not with wounded civilians. She switched to the comm. Eagle 1, this is Viper. We need extraction immediate. Coordinates inbound. Copy that, Viper? ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes in a firefight felt like a lifetime. Sarah took command, directing her team to defensive positions. Her movements were sharp, efficient. Years of leadership distilled into instinct. Every decision counted. Every second mattered. She moved from soldier to soldier, steadying them, returning fire, never once faltering. Sergeant Kane covered her flank, shouting over the noise. They're closing in. Not for long, she replied. She reached for her grenade launcher, aimed at the ridge, and fired. The explosion lit the night sky, scattering the attackers. When the helicopter finally appeared, its spotlight slicing through the darkness, relief washed over the team. Sarah ordered the evacuation. First the hostages, then her men. Go, go, go. She shouted, firing bursts to cover their retreat. Kane hesitated at the ramp. Ma'am, you next. Not yet, she yelled back. I'm last out. It was the SEAL way, leader last, always. She kept firing until every man was safe aboard, then sprinted through the dust, leaping onto the ramp as the helicopter lifted off. The compound below disappeared into a cloud of smoke and fire. Inside, everyone sat in stunned silence, catching their breath. The rescued hostages clung to life, medics tending to them. Kane looked at Sarah, admiration plain in his eyes. "You saved us all," he said quietly. She gave a tired smile. "No, we saved each other." As the helicopter roared back toward base, dawn broke over the desert, golden light spilling over the horizon, illuminating faces lined with exhaustion and pride. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The doubts, the whispers, the stares, they no longer mattered. The men who once saw her as an outsider now saw her as their leader, their protector, their equal. Back at base, when they landed, Commander Briggs was waiting. He looked her over, dusty, blood-streaked, but standing tall. "Mission accomplished?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "All hostages secured, minimal casualties." Briggs smiled faintly. "That's what I expected from a SEAL." As the team walked away together, side by side, Sarah fell into step beside Kane. The past was gone, buried in that barracks hallway months ago. What remained was something far more enduring, respect earned the hard way. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the base, Sarah Hayes, the woman who once had to fight for her place, finally stood among brothers who would follow her anywhere. Because she wasn't just a SEAL anymore. She was their SEAL. The base had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but nothing would ever be the same. The events of the past weeks had left a mark, not only on the personnel who had witnessed them, but on the culture of the entire unit. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes had become more than a figure of awe. She was now a standard, a benchmark, and for many, an unspoken inspiration. The morning after the mission, Sarah returned to the barracks. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft glow over the tarmac. She walked slowly, boots clicking against the pavement, aware of every pair of eyes that followed her. The Marines she had once trained silently, the men she had once faced in confrontation, all now gave her a respectful nod or a quiet salute. Even Mason, who had learned humility the hard way, stopped her to say, "Ma'am, thank you." Again, Sarah inclined her head briefly. Words weren't necessary anymore. Actions had spoken louder than any apology, any report, any ceremony. At the training yard, Sarah had resumed her quiet mentorship role. She worked with small teams, guiding them through tactical drills, endurance exercises, and unarmed combat techniques. She corrected stances, adjusted grips, and demonstrated maneuvers with a calm precision that was mesmerizing to watch. "You're not here to show off," she told the newest recruits one morning. "You're here to survive and to protect. Everything else is secondary. Learn discipline, not pride. Learn control, not anger." Her words weren't just instructions. They were lessons drawn from blood and hardship, lessons no textbook could teach. The young Marines listened in awe, trying to replicate every motion, every command. And slowly, quietly, the culture of the unit began to shift. Ego diminished. Respect multiplied. And in the background, an unspoken legend of a woman SEAL spread like wildfire, from recruits to seasoned officers. Commander Briggs watched all of it unfold with a faint smile. He had been at the base long enough to recognize when a presence was transformative. Hayes didn't just lead, she inspired. She didn't just fight, she instilled confidence. Most people would have let this fame go to their head, Briggs said to himself quietly, watching her correct a struggling recruit. Not her. She leads through example, not arrogance. That's rare, and dangerous in the best way. Even Mason had changed. Once brash and overconfident, He now trained harder than ever, driven not by pride, but by the silent challenge Hayes represented. Whenever he faltered, he remembered her movements, her calm under fire, her relentless focus. "She's not just a leader," he muttered one morning to Diaz. "She's a standard we can't afford to ignore." Diaz nodded solemnly. "And she makes us better." "All of us?" Weeks passed, and the base became a different place. Discipline tightened, performance improved, and a quiet culture of accountability took root. Marines began to emulate Hayes, not in personality, but in approach. They learned patience, calculated risk, and composure under pressure. They learned that a fight wasn't about brute force, but precision, strategy, and timing. Sarah never sought recognition, yet recognition found her. She received commendations for her work at the base, for the mission in Yemen, and for her continued mentorship of new recruits. Yet she remained modest. The accolades were secondary to her. The real reward was in seeing others grow stronger, smarter, more disciplined. Then came the moment that would define her legacy. One quiet evening, as she walked along the pier with Kane and a small group of recruits, a young Marine named Alvarez approached her nervously. "Ma'am," he began, voice shaking slightly, I want to thank you. For everything. For showing us how to be better. For showing me how to be better." Sarah stopped and looked at him, her gaze steady. "You don't need me to make you better," she said softly. "You need to trust yourself. You already have everything it takes. I'm just here to remind you of it." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll remember, ma'am, always." "And that," she said, looking out over the horizon as the sun dipped low, "is the part that matters most. Not me, not my record, but what you carry forward from it." Her influence extended beyond training. Word of her mission in Yemen reached higher commands. Analysts, strategists, and fellow SEALs marveled at her composure, her strategic thinking, and her ability to operate under extreme pressure. Stories of the Barracks confrontation, once whispered, were now cited in leadership briefings as examples of situational awareness and self-discipline. But Sarah never sought to make it a story about herself. To her, the legacy was in the people she trained, the young Marines who would one day step into dangerous situations, carrying her lessons with them. Months later, the base gathered for a ceremony honoring the success of the Yemen operation. Hayes stood off to the side, hands clasped behind her back, observing the ceremony quietly. Medal ribbons were handed out, photographs taken, speeches given. She didn't need recognition. The glances of respect from those who had once doubted her were more than enough. Briggs approached her quietly. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Hayes," he said. "You didn't just complete the mission, you changed the base." Sarah gave a small nod. "That was never the plan, sir." "Plans rarely survive contact with reality," Briggs said with a faint smile. "But sometimes reality ends up better than the plan." That evening, Sarah walked along the quiet tarmac, the last light of day stretching across the horizon. Her mind wandered to the future, missions still ahead, challenges yet unseen, the world still in turmoil. But for the first time, she also allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. Not for herself, not for what she had accomplished, but for the people she had influenced. For the recruits who now trained harder because they had seen her in action. For the men who had once underestimated her, but now followed her without hesitation. For the base that had learned that true leadership didn't come from rank, or gender, or reputation. It came from example, courage, and integrity. And in that moment, Sarah Hayes realized that her legacy wasn't measured by the battles she had won, or the enemies she had faced, or even the missions she had completed. Her legacy was measured in the lives she had touched, the soldiers she had shaped, and the respect she had earned, not through fear, but through unwavering excellence. Weeks later, a young Marine approached her again, a notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "Ma'am," he said nervously, Could you teach me how to lead like you?" Sarah smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't learn to lead by copying me," she said. "You learn by watching, listening, and doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. That's how leaders are made. That's how legacies are built." The young Marine nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Sarah watched him walk away, then turned toward the ocean, letting the wind whip through her hair. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her next mission awaited. But here, in this quiet place, she had left something permanent. Something that would endure long after she had gone. Because Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, Navy SEAL, had not only survived impossible situations, she had taught others to survive too. And that was a legacy no one could take away.